Most of this lesson is really just going to be me answering your questions and talking about what I'm doing and telling you how that works. It's relatively informal, so let's just get started. And like I said, if you have a question, just pop them into the comments and I'll get to them while I'm demonstrating this. So for starters, when you're doing an oil painting study, I always think it's quite useful to start out with using like a mid-tone, rather than starting out by using something really, really dark. That way, once you've filled up your canvas, you have a lot of range to explore, both on the dark and light side of the value scale. By the way, let's just shout out really quick. MJ Artwork is here. He's been with me from YouTube subscriber #1, more or less. All right, so just getting started out, I'm gonna kind of block in a pretty broad shape for the model. I've got a source image that I can kind of check out here and just see if I can get a shape that, let's see if I can just get a shape that looks kind of relatively human. Because the next thing that I want to do is start kind of establishing the basic value notes that you're going to get to. Now, there's ways to study value, and then there's ways to study value in oil paint. Obviously, oil paint is particular in the sense that it's kind of procedural. And by that I mean, you should work with it a certain way. You should have kind of steps or stages if you're going to work in oil paint. The first part of this is obviously just filling up the canvas, wherein the values that you choose are not maybe like the most important thing. This intermediate value that I'm selecting here is not like super specific. All right, there's a few people in the comments just kind of chiming in. By the way, if you have a question, just chuck it in and I'll get to it ASAP. So why don't we establish the kind of main shadow light dynamic in this. I'm going to start by taking this very dark mid-tone that I've got and kind of blocking in the shadow that you find in between the cheekbone and the widest point of the chin here. And then why don't we go ahead and also kind of block in that eye socket on the left-hand side. Now what I'm looking at here is basically the shadow and light dynamic in this portrait, meaning it's not so much the planes, it's not so much even the masses that you see, really looking at the shadow and light and how those shapes can be identified relatively quickly and simply. I think the hair also, I'm going to just treat that more or less as a large dark mass on this left-hand side. The goal here, and I want to be crystal clear about this, when you're blocking in a painting, is to get to the start as fast as possible, meaning I don't think really that your painting starts until the whole canvas is, or the whole subject that you intend to work on is blocked in. Before that, I think that we're just looking at a kind of image that's a little bit too abstract to really grab a hold of. Does that make sense? All right. Dan Stumberger is in the audience. Gavin's here. I'm expecting some comments, by the way. Where are the comments at, people? I want your questions. It doesn't have to be value related. Like, it can be anything related. Like, has anybody seen the new Idiosyncratic Nightmare podcast? That is a valid question. All right, so let's treat the top of the hair as a slightly lighter value than this side plane here. And then the bottom plane of the nose. I'm going to block that in also. You notice here that all the dark values that I'm blocking in are more or less like within the same range of value. There's not a lot of kind of value diversity happening here. And that's on purpose. You know, the earliest part of your drawing does need to be, or, by the way, Freudian slip. The earliest part of your painting does need to be more or less just a good drawing. Now that we know we're getting underneath the shadow of the chin, why don't we go ahead and kind of block that in with this full sepia, warm sepia value. So we know that that's going to be pretty dark, but definitely when we look at it in relationship to the hair, it's going to be a bit lighter. Now, with it in mind that this is going to be a lesson on how to see values better, I still need to get the rest of the canvas blocked in before I can really talk about how to see them. So if you wanted to talk about right now, like seeing these values, these actually are not values that you necessarily see so well, except for the fact that we have taken this and more or less posterized it, which is to say that we've created a notan where we have one value, two values, and maybe three values. Those aren't values that you necessarily like look at the subject and find. You just search for what the biggest contrasting shapes are if they were as simplified as possible, and then paint those. Later, we're going to get into how to actually see values better, which is to say, like, what does it look like? How do you determine the lightest light versus the darkest dark? These can be relatively generic, and I think it doesn't matter maybe as much what values you choose. Like the value that I'm making this forehead shape, you know, I'm going to change that and paint over that and paint shapes into that later. So I'm not really all that concerned about, you know, is it the right value? It's much more just about being an average of what we find there. Now, maybe if I chose pure white to put on the canvas, maybe that would be a little bit bright to paint the entire light shape then. Rumen Plaminov asks, I know you rarely work in watercolor, but how do you block in with watercolor? Rumen. In watercolor, I just do some stuff, man. I honestly don't think too much about it. Like, I don't have a technique or anything. I'm not a good watercolor painter. I'm not even replacement level at watercolor, probably. So I unfortunately, I have nothing to really offer about that. I try to keep my paint really watered down at first, so that I don't make any shapes that I can't sort of back away from. Let's see. Louis asks, how do you clean your brushes so they lose shape in time? Yeah, they do. You know, it really depends upon how you want to treat your brushes and how long you want them to last. I view my brushes as having a pretty short lifespan, so I don't treat them too well. I don't even wash them all that good. I just use a little bit of turpentine in a cup, and then I'm done with it. All right, so I'm blocking in the light shape on the right side of the face. I'm using a little bit of opacity there because I want it to feel slightly different from the shadow. However, at this moment, it should be still like really generic, because once again, I haven't keyed this painting yet. And for those of you that don't know what keying means, when you key something, it means that you're adding your darkest dark and your lightest light, and you're starting to talk about values that will more or less represent what that subject looks like in the end. So when you start getting into your major highlights, you start getting into your darkest darks, then we're talking about keying the painting. By the way, I'll probably do that about a dozen times tonight, which is to say I will refer to this as a drawing instead of a painting. Now, there's some subtle things that I'm doing, I think, where maybe I'm looking a little bit at the sort of fat pad next to the nose and how that gets a little bit darker as it turns into the nostril, or the brightness at the top of the muzzle form here. You know, I'm not without design and subtlety at this stage, but it would be inaccurate to say that I'm thinking too much about it. I'm just trying to get a good head template blocked in. One thing I will say, I'm doing this a lot lately, is respecting a lot more the fact that the lips are a darker local value than the skin around them. So rather than blocking the lips as the same value as the light shape, I've been blocking them in more as a, like even the lower lip, which is catching light, I've been blocking that in more as a lighter, or sorry, rather a darker value shape. See, Esteban Marino Weber says, do you teach workshops in Norway or Sweden? No, I don't. I don't know that I ever will, honestly. Yeah, I guess my home is in Norway, so I just think about being home and working on my art when I'm here. Whereas when I teach, it's usually I'll go to Rome or to New York or somewhere and teach there. I don't know, I guess I view teaching in person as like it's a travel activity. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are not like painting at home, at least those of you that are like watching live. But I'm sure there's a group that's going to be watching this live, or rather watching the recorded version of this after and painting along with it. I'll post my materials in the post below. So, are we blocked in? No, I want to get some of the neck in here as well. So let's get that light shape of the neck in also. And the darkness of the shadow as well, the side here. Now I think this is a really kind of cool source image. Worked with this model for ages and ages, and it's always got such a cool look to her. So hope I can do that a decent amount of justice here. Rock Lazic says, love the podcast. Do you and Michael draw and paint Eddie from tiny camera from Zoom, or do you guys use a reference photo? So for the Idiosyncratic Nightmare podcast, Michael and I usually get about 4 or 5 source images from the guest, and then we'll choose one and work from that source image. So the guest that's on screen is just the guest on screen, and then and then we're painting them from a source image that we've chosen. At first, I think in the first episode, we decided to like put the source image on screen sometimes, but then I thought, I don't know, it looks kind of boring to look at just a source image, so we decided maybe not to do that so much anymore. Let's see, Lulian says, how do you feel about working only from photos? I know that painting from life is the best. Do you think there's a growth from using photos? Yeah, of course there is. Yeah, there's people that use one or the other will kind of spin stories about how, oh, you can't do this, or you can't do that, or there's no way to do blah, 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 whatever. It's just not true. There are plenty of people who have learned to paint really well working from photographs, better than some people that have painted from life. But usually what happens is that when this argument is made, the person making the argument will choose the worst example of the opposite to prove their point. So they'll find somebody who paints really badly from photographs and they'll say, look, when you work from photographs, it's terrible. And people that work from photographs will choose, you know, some really bad life painting or whatever and say, yeah, you see, it's not a guarantee. But neither of those are true. You can make bad paintings from life. You can make no progress from life, or you can make tons of it. It just depends upon how focused you are, how good the instruction you're receiving is, the clarity of the feedback. You know, that's the things that I think make you improve. So, yeah, I mean, I had a student who out in San Diego who is like, it's kind of paralyzed by this idea that he like, you could only work from life. That's somebody told him that once, you know, and it was that became like gospel. He had to only ever work from life. And for some years, like he actually didn't produce work because he didn't have any conducive situation where he could work from life. So he was like, oh, I can't. I don't know. I hear stories like that and I think, well, that's terrible. You know, I'd much rather somebody be putting in the work than just canceling that out. Let's see. Tony Dot says, Stephen, I'm learning digitally with the 50% gray canvas. I block in the dark shapes like you're doing, but when I have to add the light values, I have issues with edges and shapes. Any tips? Edges and shapes are much more about the adjacent values than they are about how to blend, ideally. There's a little bit of blending that will happen, but if you choose your values really well, you should be able to represent the planes of the head quite good in a way that makes them look very realistic without necessarily having the problem of like blending the heck out of them. Even digitally, you shouldn't have to blend maybe too much. Juan Hernandez says, did you see the new Nosferatu movie? If so, what do you think? I'm dying to see the new Nosferatu movie. But I need to explain a couple things about keying here because I think we're getting to a pretty good place to look at that. I want you guys to notice a few things though about this, right? Because I view the keying of a painting as a process. It's something with stages that you go through, and if you use those stages well, I think you stand a good chance to make some progress and some good observations. With that being said, I've not yet touched the black on my palette. That means this has not been keyed. I've used a little bit of the white just as an example of maybe how dark the midtone that I choose is, but definitely I haven't keyed the lightest lights in this painting. It's all just a generic looking, what I would kind of prefer to as like a no tan. Or let me say that again. What I would refer to as a kind of no tan, wherein we have one polarized value or rather we have one kind of posterized value in the lights. We have more or less one posterized value in the darks, and then maybe a third value that represents the nominal darkest dark at this point. Rick Urbanowski says, why is painting better than drawing? Are you sure it is? I'm not sure that it is. But let's go about keying this, right? So when we key the painting, what happens is we're able to see the lightest light and the darkest dark. And in doing so, we can find what every value in between is. And when I say, this is how you're going to learn to see values better, this is the part that I'm talking about. Previous to keying the painting, we're just taking some kind of shots into the dark, you know, nothing too specific, nothing too literal. But now we're starting to actually observe and say, where is the lightest light? So I think the lightest light is more or less here on the forehead. I see that there are also very light values on the edge of the nose, that intermediate plane in between the top and side plane of the nose. That seems really bright to me. In fact, if you're looking at this, let's talk about something that happens all the time. I think people will look at the nose and see, oh, those highlights, they're much brighter than the ones on the forehead. This is not the case. What you're seeing there is a darker local value around the highlights. The highlight itself, the specular highlight on the forehead and on the nose, I would say are more or less the same value. So don't get fooled by darker local values around your highlights in thinking that they're going to be the lightest light. With that being said, please bear in mind, your lightest light is kind of a generic idea. It's not that we are choosing some kind of pixel of perfect brightness. We're just saying that more or less these areas seem lighter than other things. If you do that, you stand a good opportunity to orchestrate the rest of the painting in such a way that those lightest lights kind of arrive. So now that we've established these highlighted areas, I can move on to the darkest dark. I'm using kind of the same brush actually for all of this, and I'm using a lot of paper towels in between just to wipe my brush and give me like a nice clean brush that I can use to kind of apply the right value. But let's take our black and some of the sepia extra, or sorry, the warm sepia. I'm going to make a value that is really, really dark, but not perfectly black. Now I'm doing that because I always like to save just a hair, just a whisper of that black if I know I need to go like maybe a little bit further to get just that much darker. So I'm leaving myself some space at the bottom of the value scale in a similar way to what I'm leaving at the top. If I ever really needed to push a highlight further, I could go all the way to white. But in general, I think it's not really necessary. The key to making a painting seem bright, right, and how we're going to make this light shape and this forehead seem bright is not by making the ultimate whitest white. It's really about how you orchestrate all the values in the portrait overall. So if you, for instance, choose all your halftones too light and your shadows too light, no matter how white you make this, it's never going to seem luminous, right? So really, again, it's about the context. It's about all the other values in the painting conspiring together to make this seem quite bright. So the darkest dark, I could choose this in a number of places. I think that choosing it more or less right next to this shadow is pretty convenient in the sense that I'll have this value related to that one, that related to this related to that. I'll have this sort of staircase of values that I can go through to make sure each one is calibrated to achieve the right light effect. Let's see, we've got some questions coming in. One of the bunch says, is it a good idea to hold off from oil painting and just do charcoal to learn value intensity in the context of not enough money? Buy some cheap oil paints. Also, let me just say this too. I worked in charcoal as a student. I'm not really that fond of working in charcoal. I don't teach my students to work in charcoal either. We work in graphite. So let's just say I don't know that necessarily you need to use charcoal in order to learn to organize values. Again, just to come back to this point, maybe the whole point of this entire live stream is it's not about the extent of your materials. You can make a luminous drawing. So let me say it again. You can make a luminous drawing in graphite. You can make a luminous drawing in charcoal. You can make a luminous painting in oil. It's not about what the material is. It's about how you organize the values. If you do that well, you can create a strong light effect. So now I've got at least a version of this kind of blocked in, right? There's other places where I can also indicate that darkest dark. I'll get to them eventually. I think for now, I want to get to the main thrust of the lesson though, which is how to calibrate these values in relationship to each other. Now I've got my brush, which is like full of black, but because I'm using titanium white, I could probably still use the same brush to do all of it, but I'm going to switch brushes. I'm going to switch to a synthetic filbert that I've got here to go back into my lights. Now, the simplest tool in the world is right here. When you're looking at your subject and you're trying to analyze value relationships, squint down. I know you're not doing it right now because you're just listening to me talk about this, but literally, look at your source image, look at your painting, look at your drawing, squint down, and watch how two values that are quite similar to each other turn into one value when you squint. So here we're seeing two separate values with our eyes wide open. Now we're squinting way down and those two bond together into one unit. That's usually what we're looking for when we look at our source image. We squint down and look at the source image. We see that the entirety of the forehead more or less kind of holds together as one light value. Now what we have here is a highlight that stands out from the back. Let me say it again. We have here a value that stands out from the value around it. So what I need to do is raise the value in the areas immediately surrounding that highlight to get the same squinting impression. So by lightening those, I'm going to increase the unity in that lightest area of the forehead. And I'm just using pretty clear brush strokes to apply this paint. I'm not doing a lot of kind of blending or swishing or anything too funky. I mean, you can do, it's not, all that stuff's not bad, but it's also not totally necessary for what we're doing here. Now, when you're doing this, it's ideal that you paint at the same time, right? Meaning that your drawing should advance and increase in its clarity as you go. And you'll see me a few times doing this, just taking and kind of smudging an edge. I don't use anything on this palette that's toxic or any solvents and things, so not in really any danger doing this, at least not from the stuff that I'm using. If you're using like lead white and stuff like that, don't do this. Gonzalo says, what brand of oils do you use? A whole bunch of different ones. Old Holland's pretty good though. Golder is asking, is it being painted on an oil paper or other surface? This is acrylic primed linen. Let's see. A screen name I can't read says, what's the difference between using 3 pigments in a value study instead of just black and white? I just think black and white always looks so steely and gray, and I don't like the look of it. I think it looks a bit, I don't know, I think it looks a bit ugly. That's just my opinion. If you really like black and white, you know, no reason not to use it. But it's not for me. So now that I've kind of brightened this up, you can see that the forehead starts to get a bit of light around it. But let's come in and like bring in some of this very dark value that's right adjacent to it. And see if we can get an even better feeling for the values at the forehead. Now, it's at this point I'd start to maybe do a couple things that are a bit painterly. By that I mean I might sort of flick a brush stroke around a little bit, or, you know, make a bit of a flourish. You know, not because it's so important, but because it's painting and it's fun. So like, why not do that? MJ asks, are you squinting as you apply and compare the value? No, I think you squint, you decide, and then you apply. I think it kind of takes that path for me anyway. Like I don't know, am I squinting when I'm putting on brush strokes? I'm not sure. Annie Limo says, why not put the lightest light and darkest dark first? Well, I explained it a little bit in the beginning, is that you need to kind of start out your painting, and oil paint works best when it's kind of wet into wet. So when you have those lightest light and darkest dark on there first, I feel like you're kind of, you're working with this image that's a little bit too like broken up to establish the basic drawing at the start. Some people will like to do it. I think it's one of the things that I was taught, but I always found it kind of counterproductive. Like I was trying to fill the canvas, and then I was stuck with this really intense darks and really intense lights kind of bopping around on the canvas. And I always found it really distracting. So in my own practice, I just don't do that. I try and fill the canvas first with some average values, and then move on to adding my lightest light and darkest dark. So now as we progress over to the side of the forehead, right, you can see this gradation. If you compare this side of the forehead, the light shape here, to that one, see it's very bright over here, very dark over here, where it almost just like descends into shadow. And so now I'm kind of painting that gradation. I think the wrong thing to do here is to try to blend all the way through. You'd like to add your brush strokes as you go. Try to select a value on your canvas and then add that to your painting. Also, let's look at the top edge of the forehead here as well, right? Because this is something that we get wrong all the time. The hair is in itself not tremendously dark. It's a lot of light, and this edge of the forehead that we're encountering here, is not an edge where something really, really dark meets something really, really light. It's a very, in fact, like a very blended edge, almost a lost edge. So I'm going to go ahead and like lighten up the upper section of his hair. Now, how do I know that, right? Let's look at the value contrast in between these two when we're squinting down. I see this is a bit brighter than the hair, but it's not really tremendously brighter than that. And then let's look at these two values in comparison to say the darkest values over here on the left. I think that's when the truth comes out. Let's see. Ricky Santana's giving everybody hugs. All right, Rick. Good man. So I'm just going to keep kind of darkening some of these areas as we get further to the left here. Being careful not to overdo the darkness of that hair, because remember, like back here, I've got something really, really black. Now, by the way, we haven't even gotten into the key of the shadows yet. So we're still working with a pretty generic shadow value here. Why don't we fix that? So we've got this light at the forehead. We've got a generic shadow value. By the way, look at the value comparison between the forehead here and the cheek that's receiving light on the left side of the face. So much darker here, and that is why this seems dark. If I came down here and like put a bunch of really light paint in that little triangle, we'd lose all the light effect up here. In fact, that'll probably get darker as we go, as we start to key these shadows. So what I want to do is find a value for this shadow that respects its relationship to the dark, darkest dark and to the lightest light. So as I start to paint this in, painting that edge in between the two, I want to squint down and compare these two values. I want to squint down and compare those two values. I think this is too contrasting. I think I need that to be darker, maybe even significantly darker. However, there is a true thing about keying where you have some leeway. Meaning you can choose to key this, with your eyes totally squinted down or with your eyes kind of wide open. There's different possibilities in each one. I'm going to choose a pretty dark key for this just because I think that's a good kind of instructive key for students, right? So I'm expanding that quite dark value. It's not black, but it is quite dark. Partly because I know that I need areas like the nostrils and the cast shadow from the nose, for example, and this area, the lower lip. I need my pure black for that. Speaking of which, why don't we start integrating those darkest dark areas in the nose? You know what I did? I'm so guilty. The brush that I selected to use in the lights, I've now used black for it. So it's also a spent force in terms of allowing me to go back to the lights, but we move on. So I think that it's really useful to paint the nostrils and the cast shadow of the nose a bit darker than the shadow that we paint on the nose itself. This is because the nose projects outward from the face, right? Like when you look at my face from the side, you look at my muzzle form here, and look at how far my nose is like projecting out from the rest of my face, right? If we unify all this shadow together, we lose that projection. We lose that bottom plane. And I think that's not good. So I'm blocking that in as a darker value. I'm going to leave that shadow at the bottom plane of the nose. I'm going to leave that a little bit darker. Yeah. All right. Lots more work to do if this demo is going to work out, but I don't want to get caught up going into too much detail in one area. When you are painting, bear in mind, try to work as broadly as you can. Work everywhere. Getting one area like super developed, I think is, for me anyway, not the most productive way to like understand and see values well. I think it's a little bit more about trying to see the big picture. That's what we're trying to do here. Why don't we go ahead and like blocking the dark of the eye as well. So I know on that side there's going to be some dark areas also. I kind of want to know what they are. Oi. Let's see. Rumen Plamanov is asking, can you elaborate on the idea of putting contour lines of a figure over a dark versus light background? I think I heard that idea in your old podcast. It's not very clear to me. So the contour lines of a figure over a dark versus a light background. Wow, I don't know, Rumen, that might be too abstract for me to call up upon memory. If you can give me additional context clues, I might be able to get there. But as of now, that is very slightly a mystery to me. But yeah, so there's going to be obviously some darker areas in this eye socket on the right as well, as in the eyebrow also. You see the way that like one value kind of blends a little bit into the other when you're painting wet into wet. This is an asset. This is a good thing that's happening, right? It allows you to kind of build up the value relationships while kind of blending them in and making them, you know, slightly conform to the value of the previous area. So you don't get these overly kind of contrasting areas of value that don't seem to kind of sit well in relationship to each other. Right, so let's continue with this idea of blocking in these nice dark shadows. The chin, the mouth. Now, as far as the drawing is concerned here, I'm really just winging it. Just kind of going with the flow, so to speak. Trying to keep things broad and generic. Usually that's the best idea that you can have. See what happens to these values inside the eye socket as soon as I put this really kind of dark value in. Like they feel much lighter by contrast, or they appear much lighter by contrast. This is not a coincidence. By the way, let's just put it out there and say this. The white of the eye, inside the shadow, don't paint it white. This is what happens when you know you're not keying things right. You wind up painting them. What we're talking about when we do that is it's kind of a symbolic representation of the eye. It's like kind of in our imagination. When we think of the eye, we think, oh, the white, we literally call it the white of the eye, right? And that is in no way a reflection of its performance visually. Like it's not, just don't do it. I mean, almost never is the white of the eye like this super white thing. I'm just adjusting some of the values on the edges of this light shape so I can get a good impression. I think this value with the cheek over here can be a little bit lighter as it kind of creeps along that edge. Let's see. Lots more work to do, guys. Eduardo Hernandez says, Saludos from Mexico. I'm halfway on blocking bootcamp and studying in an atelier. Your work helps improve my approach. On any pose or medium, it feels like I have a belt with cool gadgets. Nice one. Yeah, so by the way, just a little bit of a plug here. This month, I'm running a campaign. It's 50% off your first month of Block-In Bootcamp. The lesson that we're doing this month is what I've called sprints. We're doing 15-minute drawings, and I found when we did this last month with my Block-In students, it was a massive accelerant in terms of understanding what a Block-In needs from you. You really have no time to mess around and put in information that is not immediately relevant and useful. You figure out very quickly what is a waste of your time and what's a good use of your time. So we're repeating that lesson again this month in Block-In Bootcamp, and right now it's 50% off. The code that you can use is all caps, one word, draw better. So if you go to my Patreon page, which there's a link in the description of this video, and use the code draw better at checkout, you're going to get 50% off your first month of Block-In Bootcamp. All right, product plug done. Back to this. I think that now we're going to start to key some of these halftones here down. Why? Why are we going to do that, right? Looking at the value here versus the brightness of the forehead, I can see that this is a very dark value. But wait, let's then look at this halftone and say this is lighter than this one. So now I'm really starting to key something. I'm looking at this not as an isolated value, but as a value in the context of other values. So I think that two things are true here. First thing is, I think I can key down or darken some of the values on this left-hand side. And I think I can then darken a little bit more some of the values on this right-hand side. Now, the worst case scenario would be that I just try and paint a value here without considering the context of all the other values in the painting. That's what you don't want to do. That's when you start getting values that don't make sense. That's when your painting starts to look flat and dull and the light effect ceases to work. That is what happens. So let's not do that. Values are about a context. Values are about relationships. As we start to darken that plane, the cheekbone above it starts to elevate. I think that can be lighter though. I think we can push that a little bit lighter. I think I've kind of keyed that down, maybe slightly unnecessarily. So let's brighten that up. Bear in mind, I'm not doing anything fancy with my brush here. Like I'm just adding in brush strokes that I think kind of fit in value-wise with what I'm seeing on the model. So not a lot of really fancy applications. Why not? I mean, I'm not against fancy applications. I mean, if you want to paint fancy applications, okay, that's fine. And I think a lot of pros will do that. I'll do that. However, when you're studying, I think the fancy applications are kind of more difficult to do and more difficult to rely on repeating. So as a teacher, you end up wanting to recommend people just rely on your values, because that's something that's, I think, a little bit more trustworthy, a little bit more translatable to as many situations as possible. So if you understand how to use your values well, you've got that in the bag. Like you're taken care of there. Let's see. Chair Curry is asking if I'll glaze color later. No, I don't. I don't mind a glaze or a scumble or different effects, but I think I kind of like a lot to just paint in grisaille. Like I quite enjoy it actually. In fact, for episode 7, I think, of the Idiosyncratic Nightmare podcast, I've taken up painting as well for the show instead of drawing. So in that episode, I think we had Ivan Loginov, who's a really great artist. We had him on and painted a grisaille of him while we were interviewing him. That was really, really fun. Actually, probably was a bit the inspiration for doing this with you guys, was how fun it was to paint that grisaille of Ivan. Let's see. Let's see. Who's got a good question here? Yeah, Tracy's mentioning Murphy's oil soap works great for cleaning brushes. It's so true. It's the sort of the the non-solvent based way to get your brushes clean. I've used it before. I think it's great. Yeah. So this highlight on the nose, I do feel like it kind of stands out a little bit too much, actually. So you need to kind of knock it back a little bit. All right, let's say a couple more things about oil painting here that need to be said. Oil painting is not for scared people. You should understand that it's okay to be a little bit bold with your application, bold with your ideas. That's all right. Cautiousness is not the only way to kind of solve an oil painting. And I think eventually I kind of admire a lot that sort of spirit of life that comes with, taking risks, taking chances when you're painting, I'm sure that there are those of you out there, and listen, I've lived this too. So this is not me saying something that is, that I'm holier than thou. I know that you've made paintings trying to be safe, and they have failed. I've done it too. I think, though, that if you are a little bit risk positive, I think that your outcomes can also be good, and you might even have like a little bit more, dare I say, fun when you're painting. So let's not over-index on safety when we're painting. Let's have a bit of risk. Maybe, God forbid, have a little bit of fun. Now, we're approaching a kind of cool part of the painting where I think a lot of the key is emerging. How do I feel about the drawing? I feel okay about the drawing. The drawing is not bad. I wouldn't say it's like overtly good either, but it's not bad. Maybe I can integrate a little bit of background around this so we can see the shape more clearly. Now, here's another opportunity for us to screw up. When you look at the relationship in between, say, the dark of the hair and the background, you see like a really big contrast. Fine. But when you look at the contrast in between the background and the lightest light of the forehead, you also see a big contrast. So, just like we did between these three areas of value, we need to, when we're painting the background, also compare that to the lightest light in the figure if we want this to stay luminous in the same way, which, for the purposes of this exercise, I do. So I'm going to paint this background as a value in reference to the lightest light. And that's going to also kind of give me an opportunity to work a little bit with the shape of the hair here, which is kind of garbage right now. Yeah, but that's, you know what, that's fine. It's fine that it's garbage. It's totally okay. Maybe even soften an edge a little bit. so I'm going to soften a little bit the edges of the hair, where the hair meets the background, and then I'm going to leave this a little bit sharper here. So I think that might be kind of cool. Again, you know, I like to be crystal clear about this. I just want to make cool stuff. I want to make cool paintings that look cool, that people like. That's my whole modus operandi. That's my whole thing. Let's see, William Bugart is asking, can you see values by going by your feeling? Well, that's a cool question. And my immediate answer is to want to say no, because really when we're talking about seeing values well, I'm referring a lot here to the idea that there is a rational process of value development that can happen. Okay, but it's not science either, is it? So I don't want to officially rebuke the idea that you can go, of course you go a little bit by feeling, everybody goes a little bit by feeling. However, if feeling is your primary mode of keying, you're gonna mess that up more often than not. So there's a balance to be struck there, right? Where I don't think we would just say just go with feeling, but by the very nature of the fact that this is a kind of fluid art form, yeah, you have to engage a little bit with feeling also. It's a balance. Everything's a balance, guys. Everything's a balance. You know it, I know it, everybody knows that. Let's see. All right, some people supporting me, saying my Patreon's pretty cool. I appreciate that a lot. JD Anarchy asks, when you're doing these block-ins, are you thinking a lot about contrast or blending? Way more about contrast than blending. Absolutely, 110, 120%. I'm thinking more about contrast than I am thinking about blending. Again, blending is great. I love blending. What oil painter doesn't want to blend? The whole medium itself lends itself to that kind of manipulation. Blending's great. However, if you over-rely on blending, especially when you start working in color, guess what? It's going to get really, really muddy, because you're going to have orange, bright, sort of rosy flesh tones in the lights, and you're going to have black in your shadows. And if you're blending that to death, you're going to get corpse purple, which you can hear from the name is not an ideal flesh tone. So again, blending's fantastic. Everybody wants to blend. You know, it's fun to blend. Is it fundamental? God, that was so bad. Oh, guys, I'm sorry. That was the worst. That was a full-on dad joke. All right. No Name says, Stephen, I've applied to Lime Academy for the fall term this year. Can you talk about the difference between the way they teach at Lime and how they taught you at FAA, comparative versus site size? Well, guys and girls, let's say this. I'm a big advocate of the Lime Academy. I love it. I love the people there. Eddie Rochat, Maya Grapide, Jordan Sokol, all good friends of mine. In fact, I'm going to release a video on my YouTube channel. I sat down with Jordan and Maya to do an interview about, well, ostensibly about my book, but then we just chatted about a bunch of stuff anyway. And so if you're choosing an atelier, I think you can do way worse than the Lime Academy. I think they're fantastic. They have a great program. The teachers there are absolutely wonderful, amazing, kind, thoughtful, incredibly talented teachers. So I would say, yeah, go there with bells on. Get there and study with them. They're great. In terms of the difference between site size and comparative, well, it's a totally different paradigm, you know, and one that personally, like, I come down on the side of of comparative measurement. I just think it's applicable in more kind of different situations than you find site size applicable. Site size is not, by the way, let's not read this as site size bad. That's not the case. Some people like to be provocative and go like, ooh, site size, it doesn't work, it's bad. It's not bad, it's just you need like a lot of studio space to do it. And it's like really utilizes a lot of, visual comparison rather than structural. And I think that can lead you sometimes to making a bit flatter paintings. That being said, guess what? Hundreds of people have used site size and made good paintings with it. There's no Excalibur here. There's no one ring to rule them all. I learned site size and I learned comparative, and I benefit from both of those. So for those of us out there trying to make the kind of straw man argument and go, site size is bad because of X, Y, Z, or because they didn't really use it in the 19th century. Who cares? Who cares? Just draw a good head. Show me that you can draw or paint a good head, and then I think that's how you win. It's not the measurement system that you use. You tell I'm traumatized by these arguments. Like people trying to, what really bothers me is the straw man argument thing, right? Like again, I mentioned it earlier in the stream. Like you can't choose the worst example of something as the example of that thing. You're just trying to at that point you have an agenda, you want to prove something, so you're cherry picking the worst version of something to make your point. There's great site size paintings out there. I've seen them, I've studied with people that have made them. There's painters like Jamie Korath out there doing great site size stuff. So let's not get into the whole, site size doesn't work thing either. Equal representation, people. That's what I'm after. Let's see. No Name asks, also, do you have a recommendation for an art smock or apron? Check this out. People, allow me to tell you, this is the best art apron I've ever had. It's actually from a company in the States called Blick. They used to be formerly Dick Blick, and I think they've just rebranded as They've just rebranded as Blick, which is probably quite clever of them for exactly the reason that I've just illustrated. But it's just like their kind of boring, run-of-the-mill, standard painter smock, and it's fantastic. I love it. Yeah, there's so many other ones that I've had that are they're too clunky, they're too thick, or the material's too heavy, or they don't kind of fall in the right way. There's a lot of ways you can kind of make a not good painting smock, but Blick did a really good job. I'm not even saying they probably knew what they were doing too much. It's just luck of the draw that so many people have made painting smocks. They happen to make a pretty good one. Let's see. Questions. Rick Urbanowski says, I've quit social media. What's a good way to display my art? Seems like creating in a vacuum is a bad idea. Rick, you're not wrong, buddy. That being said, not every social media platform is for everybody. So something that I've realized lately has become very real to me is that I don't like Instagram that much. I have 500,000 followers on Instagram, and I just don't like it that much. I don't think it's a really cool place to be. It's so fast, and nobody really pays attention, and if you make really good content, it doesn't matter. So I've just been thinking lately, I'd much rather be on YouTube. I feel like people on YouTube, and funnily enough, you see this in the comments, people on YouTube care more. People on YouTube sometimes care too much. And I would say this is pretty true across the board. Probably the roughest comments I've ever gotten on things are on YouTube. YouTubers really get into you. But it's because I think that they're spending time with you. They care about what you're doing, and they will let you know about it. So I think overall, YouTube is a kind of more cool place for me to be, at least right now, at least the way that Instagram is going right now. So find a social platform that like works for you, rather than, just saying, oh, well, everybody's here, I've got to go here. Let's see. Rohan is asking, when you do these grisaille block-ins, do you keep in mind what colors the values will eventually develop into, or do you completely turn off the color part of your site? Yeah, I think in general with these, it's about a translation. Our eyes, I think, have particular problems with some visual phenomenon, right? Like, and I want to do more of these videos where we kind of just explore an idea, more of these live streams. But when there's a very strong color contrast, it's actually quite difficult for your eye to kind of grab a hold of that. Meaning, like, if you have a green dot in the middle of a red field, determining what that value is can be really hard. And that follows with things that are also like a little bit less contrasting than that, like if you have, a really strong chromatic flesh tone next to something also chromatic, that's going to be kind of difficult to tell exactly what value that is. So yeah, I try as much as possible just to be like in value brain, when I'm working on these. But I try to do that also when I'm painting in color. I try to be as value based as I can be. But eventually, let's also clarify. Like, eventually, when you're painting in color, this is why I think painting is so hard to teach. Like, you need to be everywhere. Like, there's nowhere to hide when you're painting, but especially when you're painting in color, you just need to do it all. You need to do it all right now. The idea that, there's different painting techniques. I know there's glazers out there that will, paint some things really directly and then kind of glaze a lot of other stuff in. That's fine too, but you're still kind of working with the same dynamic where you're trying to see really clearly the values and eventually see the colors well through that. So the standard idea applies, meaning you've heard that phrase that value does the work and color gets the credit. That's very much because I would phrase it this way, that in fact you'll never get the right color without the right value. Because if you get the quote-unquote right color at the wrong value, that means you need to add something to it. Therefore, you are changing the color and the hex number, or the, let's say, the Munsell location of what that color is. So there is no right color without the right value. Whereas you can get the right value without the right color. So it's kind of the primacy, I've heard it referred to as like the primacy of value. I think it's a good phrase. Let's see. Golder is asking, "Are you still an enemy of Strathmore?" I hope it never gets back to him. I don't want to get an email from like the the social media people at Strathmore hear about what I say, but I don't like it. I don't rate them. At least not there. They have that kind of generic sketching paper, right, where it's like Strathmore sketching 400 or something, and it's guys. I don't like it. I got nothing for it. I'm sorry, Strathmore. I'm sorry, Strathmore lovers. It's not for me. M.E. says, but local color is relative. You need to explain that further. Obviously, everything that you choose is in one sense or another relative, but the way in which local color is relative, I think you need to unpack that a little bit further. By the way, local color just refers to like what is the color of the object itself. So the lips have a redder local color than, say, the plane of the forehead, for example. Calder is saying, boom, cancel from Strathmore. Yeah, they're going to come after me, guys. I know they are. Let's see. Mogomotsi says, here to say I love your heavy metal portrait drawing course on Patreon. Rock and roll, people. Yeah, there was an inspiration that I had a while back looking at drawings by an artist called Vasily Grebennikov that just kind of blew my mind. Like, they were just so good. And in ways that, like, my drawings had just never been good in that way. You know, like, I drew accurately and all that stuff, and you get a likeness and et cetera, et cetera. But then, like, I feel like they kind of lacked a kind of power, you know, a kind of, you know, I call it kind of blood and thunder, right? You know, like this feeling of being really dramatic. And so I knew that, I saw that in his work. So I just thought, well, if he can do it, then I can probably learn how to do it from him. And if I was going to do it, I thought, well, I bet my Patreon subscribers would like the same thing. So I decided to make a course out of it. Let's see. A lot of comments coming in. Galder says, I just rewatched an old video with Proco and you were hating on them. Hating on who? On Proco? On Strathmore. Probably on Strathmore. Yeah. All right. There's a lot of comments coming in about Strathmore. Let's see. Armander is saying Stephen's more of a Canson guy. In fact, no, I'm more of a Stonehenge guy. Yeah, the Stonehenge is a paper made by Legion. If you have my book, they're the paper that all the drawings in my book are made on. And like, I just use it. I have just rolls of it. I have packs of it. I have so much of it. Just because at a certain point, you know, I realized it was the paper that was going to get me where I needed to go 99 out of 100 times. And so I don't kind of mess around too much with that part of my process anymore, like switch between papers. I will, you know, on occasion, you know, if I find some new paper that seems like it's going to be interesting, or I'm in a place where I can't get Stonehenge, maybe I'll mess around, find a new paper. But in general, I like to keep it consistent. And I'd recommend that generally for students too, is like, if you go changing your materials all the time, you're kind of like just changing the dynamic like all the time on yourself. And it's going to be really hard to, you know, get consistent results if you're creating an inconsistency. All right. Now, there's a lot of gaps right now in the painting. Like, there's a lot of like spaces where I kind of have some things in, but like they're maybe halfway developed. So, I mean, this might be just the live stream dynamic where I can't really get as far as I want to go. But let's see what we can do. Maybe I'll try to paint the eyes a little bit. Let's do some eye painting. I don't mind painting a bit of eyes. Now, I've got my smaller brush out here, and kind of maybe just getting into detail, such as it is. Pay attention to the value of the whites of the eyes, people. It's pretty dark. It's going to stay that way. I mean, that might even be like too, I might even have them too light. Maybe too light, those ones. By the way, like when you notice me get quiet, that's when the painting's really going, like when it's really happening. All the riffing and joking and stuff. It's the same on the podcast, right? So if you don't know, the Idiosyncratic Nightmare podcast is a show where Michael Klein, who's a good friend of mine, a really, really amazing artist, get together and we make a portrait of the guest while we're interviewing that guest. So there'll be these moments where like I'm really, really intently working on some area of the drawing and I forget and I just like go silent. I forget that there's like a guest there. I forget that Michael's there. I'm just sort of like deep into the, kind of work world. And now I'm doing that to you guys. Okay. BTT says, Strathmore is pretty much all I use because that's the primary paper all my stores carry. Yeah, listen, this is the thing. They've got amazing distribution. If only the quality of their paper matched. Please don't tell anybody from Strathmore about this live stream. Lillian says, I bought the Sketching 400 series and used it 1 or 2 times, never since. Indeed, that one has really bad paper. I think I need to change the subject. I feel like we're kind of piling in on Strathmore. You know what? All right, let's say this. I'm mystified by this, but there's artists, really good artists that I know that use Strathmore. And every time I've used it, I've just thought like, I want anything except this. But they use it and get good results. So hey, that's what balance sounds like. My conscience feels clear now that I've said that. By the way, there's some really great reflected light under the nose. Now here is the deal, people. Reflected light, don't overdo it. Don't underdo it, right? Don't leave it out, but let's be real. If you make that reflected light as some of the values out here, it's not gonna end well. So you got to use some of it, but not a ton of it. And also, let's dispel a myth. How about Art Myths 101, right? The darkest dark, wait a minute. The darkest light is always lighter than the lightest dark. I mean, there's a lot of situations in which that's true, but not all of them. I mean, there are situations where you'll find a reflected light, an ambient light in the dark area of the face or in the shadow that's lighter than the darkest light. So I just don't think it holds up in all situations. It holds up in many situations, and I think that's what carries it along. That's what like perpetuates that idea. But it's not. I'll tell you, it's not all the time. So we can't say that as though it's like a catch-all for the truth. It's not. I wish it was, guys. I wish it was, but it isn't. Let's see. M.E. says, I just mean when matching values, is it not based on how you set up colors next to each other, which will affect the eye, or am I misled? Well, definitely there is, right. So I think what you're referring to here is how color contrasts, right? So that if you have a green field and you put a red dot in that red will seem more intense than it would be if it was a chromatic red dot in a low chroma red field. So yes, there is a kind of relativity to it in that but that's kind of true also of like any color that you put into a painting whatsoever. Like it's all relative in that sense. So that's what I was talking about with these value studies too, is that everything in the painting needs to come together for this to feel bright. If I use too light value anywhere, that will not reach its full potential. So when we talk about relativity in color, it's the same. If all of the color in your painting is a little bit too red, and then you try to make the lips feel red, you're not going to be able to, because there's an overwhelming amount of red that is there that is kind of overpowering what the red that you're trying to express is. So everything in that sense is, to use your words, relative. Absolutely. 100%. Local colors, but also colors that are produced everywhere. Rock says, where do you buy art supplies? Wherever they got them. There's things that I can't get here in Norway, so I'll shop at a shop called Jackson's online. And I've had some good experiences with Jackson's, but I've had some bad experiences with Jackson's. So just, you know, make sure that you order the thing that you want, because I had some problems with them about, they had kind of listed something on their website and then they had sent me the wrong thing, right? So I was ordering a palette and they sent me like the wrong palette. Like, and I knew it was the wrong palette because I've owned that exact palette before. I was just ordering another one. And I got on with their sales team or their customer service team, and their customer service team proceeded to try to convince me that I was wrong. And admittedly, like, I'm not perfect. Like, I can get things wrong, but this one simply was not. And I was sending them photographic evidence, you know, proving exactly what was true. And what it was is they had a product SKU, like the item listing number, was wrong in their ordering system. And so they had sent me the wrong one. It just took me a really, really long time to prove that to them. And I felt they were a bit condescending as they were attempting to gaslight me into thinking that the palette was the right one. So every other experience I've had with them is great. But I don't know, maybe their returns policies are not so evolved. I'm just lighting up everybody. Strathmore and Jackson's, I'm going after them all. Let's see, Armander asks, what would be the Coke versus Pepsi of artist paper? Well, I think definitely that Strathmore could, right, wait, actually, you know what? Before I get to that, I want to talk about something over here. So now we've got this space defined. I think the relationship in between this cheek and that cheek is pretty good, right? I think that the values here are pretty good in relationship to these light ones. But now I need to massage that value relationship in between these two. This is where conventionally a student might start blending. But what I'm going to try and do is choose a value that sits in between these two. And that should make it a lot easier for me to blend. Now, like I said, there is blending. Blending's good. We all like to blend. But blending with the right values is the most effective way to do that job. So you see now that I'm putting this value in between the two, and it almost looks like the blending is happening on its own, just by choosing values that are close enough together. Now, look at that edge, right? A minute ago, it was this stark contrast. Now we have this beautiful kind of blended edge. That is the power of using the right values. And I have to do the same thing down here, right? This is too light down here. And it's making the top of this look too dark, right? Because that was the same exact value in both places. Right, now we're darker down here, lighter up here. Look at these value contrasts. That is working pretty well. Jan Art says, do you compress the shadows, pushing them to be darker just to make more room for the mid and light values? That is one way that you can key things. And this is my overall, my meta message about keying. It is about a choice. Maybe, you know what, maybe in another live stream, I'll do a key, I'll do a similar painting, but I'll key it totally differently, right? The relationships that you choose in between the values are what's really important, more so than, say, what just the individual values themselves actually are. They're both obviously very important to get the job done, but you have multiple ways that you can choose to key. And I think that's a big takeaway. If you're walking away from this live stream with something valuable, I would say it should be that keying is kind of it's the way that we organize the statement that we're trying to make, right? Like, there's a way to key this where we're looking at it with our eyes open. There's a way to key this where we're really, really squinted down. Both of those are kind of valid, useful, kind of interesting spaces to be in. A lot of questions coming in. Emma Radeva says, when do you begin to establish the smaller planes of the head? I get good values going on, but always end up with sort of big, shapeless masses that are correct but ugly, generic, as you say. Yeah, when do you start doing it? I mean, that's a cool question. When? I mean, I think a lot of the whens in painting are a matter of, they're dependent upon how the painting is going. Like, so obviously you try to establish the broad planes early and get those working really, really well, so that then when you put in the small planes, you have a really great foundation to kind of work on top of. I don't think that there's like well, first of all, let's say this. There is no arbitrary when. There's no big when in the sky that just arrives and says, yes, now it's time to do that. That will never be a thing. But I would say that you have to go through the stages of a painting such as they are. Once you blocked in, I think you have to then start working on the smaller planes. And you know what? You'll probably do it, and you'll probably do it badly. And then through practice, eventually you'll do it well. Your challenge here is not so much figuring out, when to do that, as much as, what it is in your paintings that's not allowing you to do that well. I mean, maybe those early proportions aren't all that good. Maybe they are, who knows? But then I think that there are also other things that kind of take over, which is, having a knowledge of the planes of the head. Now, we all know that everybody looks different. We're all little snowflakes, we're all totally unique, and everybody looks very different. That's true. However, there are many things that we also have in common. That's why, we're the same species, for goodness sake. We have a lot in common. So a few years ago, I decided to make the Head Study app as a way just to share my view of the things that we have in common. So it's a planes of the head model. It's a skull, and it's an écorché head as well, which an écorché head is just a head without skin or fat on it, showing the surface anatomy. Very soon, soonish, is coming out the female planes of the head model that I've been working on for, probably we started work on it, honestly, like right after the launch of the Head Study app initially. So I'm trying to wrap up those planes of the head models. I'm trying to do it this month. I'm trying to do it ASAP. So that will come out in my Head Study app as soon as I can get it, guys. I'm working so hard, believe me. But knowledge of the planes of the head will then help you to kind of see them a little bit more clearly, right? So it's like the more that you know, the more that you can see. Like, I'm kind of a pretty firm believer in that. I mean, learning anatomy doesn't make you a better painter. It just gives you the opportunity to, I think, see a little bit more. So again, rather than being deterministic, I think it's just an opportunity. It's Eddie Rochat, who we interviewed for the first episode of Idiopod, referred to it as the spices, not the meal. So it's not going to get everything to arrive, but it's really going to pack in the flavor on the stuff that you are able to manifest. So more knowledge and more experience is usually what I would say kind of leads to eventually having a better head, when you've finished painting it. That's not even to speak necessarily of composition, but I'm sure we'll do another stream that goes into composition studies as well, just because I feel like, well, why are we all doing this? Why are we even here? What is the point, And then the answer to that is composition. So that's another topic. I mean, there's lessons on my Patreon about it. Everybody here, you probably know that if you're on my Patreon, but if you don't, a lot of the stuff I talk about here, obviously I talk about it much more in depth on my Patreon page. Let's see. Rohan asks, I wonder why grisailles are so often done with colors like burnt umber. Why is black not used alone? And I suppose the painting just becomes too cool in temperature. Yeah, somebody asked this earlier in the stream, and I just, the only answer I have is like, I just don't like the way it looks. You know, it just looks too cold and steely for skin, you know? I remember there was, so when I went to the academy, we had one of my teachers, of course, and the director of the school was Dan Graves. And Dan's like one of these guys who's like he's a really good speaker, and because he's really convincing and really sharp wit. But he was doing a lecture about sort of ancient drawing materials, and he was talking about sanguine, and he did that thing. And all right, I like Dan, but this thing I don't like. At least when teachers used to do it to me a lot. Was they know the answer to the question, and they know that you don't know the answer to the question, and then they ask the question. So he asked the crowd, like, so why did artists in the 15th century or whatever start using sanguine? It wasn't the 15th century, it's probably older than that. But my point is that he was asking this question, and nobody knew the answer. Certainly nobody knew the answer that he wanted to hear. But, you know, in those situations, I don't, you know, I'm just like, fine, I'll guess something. So I think I guessed, I forget what it was. I was a student, so I might have guessed something like, oh, it's cheaper or something, you know, like it's earth, so it's really available. And he was like, no, that's not it. Which is always what happens when you answer a question like in a lecture that you don't know the answer to. It's always like, oh no, God, no, that's not it. And eventually the answer that he wanted to hear was, because sanguine, right, which I think it's either, whether it's Italian or Latin or whatever, but the word itself means blood, right? So it's this substance that is, in a way, quite human on its own, right? It has this connection to human beings and to life and that, which is like, it's cool, like it's really deep to think about that stuff, and it's really awesome. But the reason I think, and back to your question, the reason I think we wind up using something like umber is because it just seems to me, I think, more akin to like a living person, more alive than, say, just black and white might do. Now, can you use black and white? Yeah, of course you can. I don't know. Maybe even black and white looks cooler to some people, but not to me. Me says, M.E. says, I really want to find laid paper that's what the students at the Julienne and the École used to use in the academic full-body drawings, apparently. So a laid paper, as far as I understand it, right, is one of these papers that's made on these specific kinds of screens. The paper pulp is like put onto these screens, and then correct me if I'm wrong about this, by the way, because my knowledge of it is not deep. But laid paper has this kind of slight texture to it, almost like a very fine tooth corrugated cardboard. And when I was a student, we used something called Roma paper, which was really incredibly, phenomenally rough. Like it was the roughest paper. And actually halfway through my student career, they changed the screens at the makers, and it got even rougher. So you went from this like fine tooth corrugated cardboard to like just straight up like corrugated cardboard. It kept being used at the school, and I thought the paper was really, I didn't like it for drawing. I don't like it for drawing now. The argument was that it holds a lot of value, and it can take a lot of punishment, which up to a point is true, but like, there's a lot of papers that do that, you know? It's not the only paper in the world that's like going to take a lot of punishment. So eventually, like laid papers, if you get one that has a decent kind of fine tooth, great. But there are some out there that are really, really super intense, and I wouldn't recommend those. BTT says, newsprint is good for sketching, gestures, anything under an hour, but not for finished work. Yeah, I go back and forth on it. I mean, I know there's schools out there that will use newsprint and stuff. You know what? I mean, really, the truth is, I just never used them. So, like, my view of it is not for the utility of it, but just for how fragile it is. So I don't use it. But you know, if you do, I mean, I guess that's cool. I don't have any kind of recommendation or really any opinion about it. Rick Urbanowski says, our canvases different textures similar to the tooth in drawing? 1000%. They are all different textures, different characteristics. They do different stuff, and should be regarded as such. Like, they're there. Canvases are there to hopefully make your life easier. Find one that you like or is recommended to you and stick with it. If you're changing canvases, and I see, by the way, I've been working with students for like 20 years. I can't count that out, but like I've been teaching since 2006. So 19 years. So I've seen just about every misstep a student can make, at least in this narrow paradigm of drawing and painting stuff that looks like stuff. So one thing that I see students do all the time, and that you shouldn't do, is switch up your materials for every project you do. So they'll do one painting on this linen that's really, really rough. And then for their next painting, they'll work on a linen that's really, really smooth. This is a great way to make your life difficult, and I don't recommend it. Sure, experimentation is good, but I think you should probably take that with a very keen eye towards controlling that experimentation. Meaning, if you're going to experiment with a new linen, maybe just do a little alla prima painting, right? Don't invest in doing like a giant project on a linen that you've never worked with, because you might hate it. There are canvases, or I think about this more in terms of papers. There's like papers that I've worked with that I thought, wow, this is really great when I'm blocking in. And then when I go to refine it, it's like, I hate it. And it won't do the thing that I want. And it's really, really hard to work with. So there can be surprises, you know, in Norway you call it like a troll in a hat, right? An unexpected surprise. An unexpected bad or negative surprise, because all surprises are unexpected by definition. But yeah, like, you don't want to find that out on a project that you're deeply invested in. So if you're experimenting, make the project suit that characteristic, that nature of experimentation. Let's see. Nick B says, Strathmore vellum is perfect for me, and I make no bones about that. I haven't tried it. I admit I have not tried their vellum. Maybe it's good. You know what? Maybe it's good. Maybe it'll change everything I think about Strathmore. I'm willing to be wrong, but I need to find the paper that makes me see that. Let's see. Nathan Edwards says, Daleroni paper seems to be the easiest available paper in my city. Have you heard or tried them? I feel like I've heard the name, but I don't think that I've tried any of their products. Daleroni. Yeah, I mean, I know, and by the way, like, paper manufacturers now, like, that industry is kind of going through, I think, the same thing that a lot of industries go through, where, like, a lot of the larger companies, like, kind of buying up smaller companies. So, like, you might be working on a paper that Daleroni, like, owns that maybe wasn't originally owned by them or whatever. It's not a bad thing. It's just, Daleroni is like this parent, as far as I understand, is like this parent company. Because I've seen that on a lot of different products, that brand. Okay, so, I mean, how are we going portrait-wise? I feel like it's okay. I feel like there's some decent enough painting taking place in here. You know, maybe not a full rendered portrait, but definitely more than enough to make a good value study. And this is like the thing maybe to take away also, because I think we're about an hour and a half in. I don't know if I'll do a full 2 hours, but I'll keep working on this for a little bit. When you're doing a study like this, you know, it's okay if we don't arrive to like a perfect rendering. You know, the whole idea that we're trying to get to is to understand how to use value better, how to see value better, and how to do that in oil paint. So with that in mind, you know, perfection is not the goal or the target that we're making. I think we just want to progress a little bit, learn a little bit. So if you look at your painting and you think, oh, the likeness isn't perfect, I think that invalidates the process. I think that probably more often than not, when you're a student, your likeness isn't going to look good. My likenesses didn't always look good when I was a student. So yeah, let's have some realistic expectations about what this is, what our journey is here, people. It's like the end of the stream and I'm getting like intense. BTT says, I want to try Stonehenge again, but the last time I did, it was like drawing on thick tissue. I'm not going to tell my friend Michael Ginsberg, who runs Stonehenge or Legion Paper, that you said that. I won't do it. No, but Michael's a really, really cool guy, and I've known him for years. But thick tissue, that's harsh. That's harsh. I think Stonehenge is great. I love Stonehenge. And I'm just putting that in for balance now. I think Stonehenge is pretty cool. Madeline says, who are you interviewing next for the podcast? I would love an interview with Cornelia. So coming up on the pod, we've got quite a few episodes we've already recorded. So the next one that's going to be released is with an artist called Tanya Revilis. She is a painter of Russian descent. She lives in Portugal. I think she has a studio in Munich as well. But just a really cool person, like really chill, interesting conversationalist. I think, you know, she was more or less kind of self-taught. So I think a lot of people are going to get, or a lot of viewers are going to get a lot of value out of, you know, what her experiences are like kind of as a pro in the world. You know, like it's different when you've learned kind of from yourself. You know, it comes with different kinds of, I think, insecurities. She does an amazing job, has no need to be insecure, but I think all of us artists are a little bit that way. But they're different. Like I have, you know, a different set of insecurities, like, you know, because I was at an academy, like I've got a lot of weird hang-ups about different things. But Tanya sheds light on those, and I think it was a really cool, really fun conversation. But then after that, I think it was Tanya. After that, we talked with a filmmaker. And this is, by the way, this is the cool thing about the pod. This is why the pod is cool in the first place at all, is it's not just about painters, folks. The whole idea is that really anybody can sit for a portrait. So if you're a filmmaker, if you're an author, if you're a dietitian, probably won't interview dietitians. But even if there was a particularly compelling, interesting, fascinating dietitian out there, we could interview them. We could make their portrait. That could be a cool show. So it's really not just artists. And I didn't want to do, like, this is the thing. I didn't want to do just another art podcast. I wanted it to be something that could be broader than that, could touch more topics than that. Because I don't think artists are like just these sort of monolithic personalities where we're just like, I'm an artist, so I'm only interested in art and I only want to hear from people that do art and do the same art that I do. You know, like I want a variety of input. Like I want to hear stuff from, personally, like my own personal interest. I want to hear stuff from filmmakers. I want to talk at length to people that make movies, animators, filmmakers, anybody in that space. I'm kind of fascinated to talk to. So the third episode is with a filmmaker named Joe Hawkins, who Michael knows. and is a really cool, really interesting guy. He's worked with a lot of, like he's made a lot of films like about artists and stuff. So it's like really kind of in our niche, but at the same time, you know, kind of coming to storytelling from a slightly different angle, which I find really fascinating. And Cornelia will be there too. My wife Cornelia will definitely interview her. Hani El Zaidi says, I'm from Egypt. This is my first live episode with you, although I have seen many episodes on your channel, and they're all very beautiful and rich with technical information. Thank you, Hani. Lillian says, what would you consider doing a watercolor live stream? I will never, let's put this on, you know, in ink. Let's write this down in ink. Let's carve this in stone. I will not be doing a watercolor live stream. I'm too bad at watercolor. I'm not really good at watercolor. Believe me, if I felt I had something to offer, I would paint in watercolor with you guys, but it's so hit or miss. I used to do it. Like, the whole reason I ever did watercolor is that I would, with my wife, we would travel to Norway during the winters to kind of be with her family, and during the summers too. And so, like, I needed something portable, something that I could kind of do while I was, you know, away from my studio, and that was watercolor. You know, I could just, all I had to do was have my little pochade box, bit of watercolor in it, and I could paint to my heart's content. It's the only reason I ever did anything in watercolor, and I love some of the work that I made. Like, I think it was great. Like, I really cherish some of that work and those experiences. But I can't do it live. I'm not nearly good enough to do it live. I mean, it looks like I'm here painting live, and I'm like, da da da, I'm just chit chatting and doing stuff. I mean, I've been oil painting for like 20 years, so the level of focus that I need to have to do it proficiently is a lot less than it would be with watercolor. I'm like, oh God, I did everything wrong, and I'm like screwing up, and like, you know, there's too much that can go wrong with watercolor to do that live. Or maybe, you know, maybe we'll do a screw up stream. Maybe that will be, you know what I mean, that will really bring it home to people, like how hard it is to work in watercolor. Okay, let's see. Cosmic Grub says, just discovered an app called Value Study. It helps simplify values in grayscale. Yeah, there's another app called the Notanizer, which is a really cool one that I used to use when I was a student, that helps to kind of simplify value. You know, in the end, at the end of the day, at the end of the long day, when you're really trying to do this, eventually those apps will become redundant, but they can be a cool kind of stop off along the way. But like anything, it's you know, the real magic is going to happen when you're doing it with your eyes and you're seeing it. Like, that's the target. That's where we want to be. Nothing wrong with those apps. Great, use them, and then get good at it, and then abandon them. I think that's the idea. All right, wait, where are we? Armando says, where's the warm hue for the Aki coming from in your palette? Skin looks reddish purple. This is a color called Warm Sepia from Old Holland. This is Ivory Black, and this is a Titanium White. So that's where the warmth is coming from. BTT says, I go to Blick, but the dreaded Michaels is closer to me. They never have anything except a ton of Strathmore. Yeah, Michaels in the US is like this sort of craft shop that, again, like, they decided that they would master distribution and being a big hobby store. And so, like, a lot of small art stores have been kind of swallowed up by them. And unfortunately, they don't, like, if you're a professional artist, I feel like they have precious few things that they can offer you, if anything at all, really. Nathan Edwards says, oh wait, sorry. There's a couple of people commenting to a couple of the people. I want to get to the questions. It's a lot of paper talk, a lot of deep. For those of you who want deep paper talk, head to the comment section of this stream. It's all there. Zach says, I would say the darkest dark saying works because at an intermediate level, choosing a reference that has that exception would be seen as a mistake on the artist. Well, Zach, like I want to agree with you because you've thought this out and you're putting forth an interesting idea. But unfortunately, I just think that it's actually the inverse. There are more situations in which it's not true than situations in which it is. The only place that you really find a truth, like an immutable truth in that, is in these studio environments with primary dominant light source situations, which happens to be where academies are. Like I learned to draw in an academy with amazing natural light all the time. However, that is actually the exception. That's not normally what people work in. So you have these rules like the darkest light is lighter, the darkest light is always lighter than the lightest dark. People go to say like some painting, some live painting session at their local art center, and it's like lit from every possible direction, and they're like, I don't get it, I don't understand. So I think we could just say, I mean, I would replace it with, let's just look at the actual values as they are. Let's not put a mandate on what the values can and can't be. So it's not that it's like a bad saying or that there's not situations in which it can work. It's just that, like, I think it's a little bit unnecessary to go through that, you know. And in fact, I think there's beautiful lighting situations in which that's not true also. And I say this as somebody, again, like I was raised on primary dominant light source. I was raised, you know, in environments where that statement could be broadly taken as fact. But subsequently, you know, in my professional career, in my career as a teacher, I've kind of backed off of that. I don't like it quite as much as I did. It can be like kind of a little bit useful, you know, at first, just as like, oh, hey, this is an idea, you know, and that kind of works in some places, but it's definitely more often untrue than it is true. So Zach, I appreciate the comment. I appreciate you, man. But I respectfully disagree. Hani El-Zaidi says, how do the artists choose the suitable art school for themselves? And what is your opinion in the Expressionist school? Who's the best painter? Who's the master of the style in this school? I don't know a lot about Expressionists and Expressionism. You know, my training, of course, was in a school that referred to itself as being classical realism, which is, I think when that kind of name was chosen for what that school was teaching, I think it was more of like a, how can people understand this perspective than it was, like it's not, like classical is different. Classical is like an era of history. It's not a necessarily like a style in and of itself. And then the style that we find ourselves painting is not really conforming to the painting that happened in that era. So in a long and roundabout way, I would say that I was not raised in the Expressionist school, so I don't really know a lot about it. But I think that there were artists that were representational, and then maybe they were on the edge of representational, that they were far more stylized, far less naturalistic, that I think were really cool. And that's like Egon Schiele and Gustav Klimt. I think they were amazing artists. They were Viennese, and I want to say that Expressionist era, or rather I think they didn't actually call themselves Expressionists, and they probably weren't really, you shouldn't be able to categorize them that way, because Expressionism was like kind of crazy. It's kind of like more abstraction than it was representation. But so as far out as I go into that space is probably Schiele and Klimt. who I think are incredible artists. I mean, hands down, amazing, phenomenal. Some of the great artists of human history. MJ Artwork says, how are you thinking about form and structure in this moment? Are you prioritizing more value relationships and shape design? I think in this moment, the values are starting to get like a little bit closer together. So you're starting to see things that look more like gradations, you know, rather than things looking like these disparate blocks of value. So in that sense, at this moment, I'm thinking a lot about value relationships, but I think equally about shape design. Oil painting, in the best case scenario, is a space where kind of all this stuff happens at once. That's what you want to be happening. So that you could prioritize, say, you know, a different kind of shape design or something, or whatever at one point or another. It's hard to say that you would do that. I think that ideally you just want everything to happen at the same time. And that's more or less what I'm shooting for here, is to try to get kind of everything to happen at once. If I'm doing my job, a lot of things are happening at once. I want to bring her, well, you know, all right, so she's got her hand down here in the pose. But I don't actually think that I'm going to paint that, so I'm just going to pretend that she has like these shoulders coming out here. Because it seems kind of weird, like just coming down. I don't like the cropping. Now I like the cropping like a little bit better. Yeah, that seems cool to me. You know, when you're painting, I was saying earlier, you want to be like risk positive. Don't be afraid to like make a bit of a mess doing stuff or leave a weird brushstroke around. It's not a big deal. Josh Breedlove says, howdy from Longview, Texas. My dad lives in Longview, Texas. What are you doing, Josh? Have you revisited the Nerdrum Museum, or have I visited it? What are your thoughts on his work, namely his technique and methods? By the way, Longview's fine. It's just a shock you never hear people from Longview. My dad is the only one I know from there. I think Nerdrum's great. I think he's really cool. He paints really well. I think his work is fascinating. I think he's probably one of the, well, not probably, he is one of the great artists of the 20th century. Like, he's a person, and it's so rare nowadays, that merits historical mention. Like, he's incredible. You can like or not like his work. Not to say that because he's that way that you need to like what he does. I think sometimes like he takes a view on humanity that's a bit more negative, and that's not really my vibe, you know, so I don't always vibe with his work, but his capacity as an artist is kind of undeniable. If you're denying that he's like a great artist, I think you're worried about something else, and I don't know what that something else is. But I haven't been to the museum. There's a new Odd Nerdrum museum that they built to house just his work, but I just haven't been there. I've been busy, Josh. I've been busy doing other things. So I haven't gotten out to it, but I would love to. I'm sure my wife also is a big fan of his work. She knows him a lot better than I do, as she's Norwegian. You know, all the Norwegian artists kind of know each other a bit. So she's got some background with Odd and his people. Josh says he's been a long time subscriber and it's helped me become a better teacher. Hey, glad to hear it, man. Glad to hear it. I think it's great to hear when stuff that I'm putting out there in the world is contributing values to people's lives, or value to people's lives. And I never, ever, ever tire of hearing it. So if you are out there and you feel like something I'm doing is contributing value to your life, please don't hesitate to let me know, because it keeps me going. Or you can be like one of these other YouTube people who's like, hey, you just made this whole big video, but you suck. Which is a very popular thing to do on YouTube. Let's see. Benjamin Meyer says, do you have any exercises, projects, ideas to specifically practice brushwork? I would say alla prima is probably your best bet there, you know? I mean, alla prima is pretty much brushwork. That's the whole job, is to solve it in a brushstroke. There was a painter that I knew in Florence he had trained more in kind of a, you know, what we would think of as like a Russian style, but he was a landscape painter. And I think he mentioned to me once, and it always kind of stuck with me, that, you know, his teachers had told him, try and solve it in a brushstroke. You know, like don't wait to render, don't wait for some elaborate solution, some glazing, a palette knifing, scum, all this stuff. Solve it in a brushstroke. And it has a way, like, I believe that these limitations have like a really cool way of sort of teaching you something. You grow through limitations like that. And you can see that in his work. Like he was like really, really clever with a brushstroke. And that didn't happen by coincidence. It happened because he worked exactly to get to that space. So I think alla prima is great. And I'll just take the opportunity to say, there is a whole lesson on alla prima painting on my Patreon page for literally $10. You can get access to dozens of highly orchestrated, edited lessons on painting and drawing. I think that, I've said this before in videos, I think it's like one of the best values on the internet. And I say that because I've been doing Patreon for like 7 years. This is my job. This is like my full-time job. I've adapted an entire atelier curriculum to Patreon in highly produced, edited, succinct videos about how to draw and paint representationally. And I just don't know where else you're getting that level of production and specificity for $10. So go there, figure it out. JD Anarchy says, have you ever worked with a black background or a black page? Yeah, it was really popular when I was a student. All the works that we did were dark background because they reasoned at the time that like that was the way, which I disagree with, that was the way to like make sure that you got a good light effect. Subsequently, I don't believe that that's really true, that that's even the best way to get a good light effect, let alone the only way. So I don't do it often now, just because I find it a little bit cumbersome personally. But there is, like, my lesson on cast painting features a black background. So that's probably the most recent thing I can think of. I did a couple of portraits a few years ago that were all black background. I don't do it very often. Let's see. Emma Redeva says, who would be a dream guest on the pod? Emma, thank you for asking me this. There's so many people that would be a dream guest on the podcast. And I know that all of you folks out there, you're just out there living your lives, doing your thing, and you just happen to be here on this live stream. But if I can galvanize a community of people, because I think it will take that to get some of the guests that are my dream guests, like my absolute 1000% dream guest would be Alberto Mielgo. He's a director and an artist that I just think he's just one of the coolest, best, most interesting artists out there working right now, and making movies. And I would love to have him on the pod. He's on my short list of people that I'm gonna reach out to and cross my fingers that I can get. But if you ever see him at a cocktail party, tell him he's got to come on the show. But But he would be an absolute dream guest. Amazing, amazing, amazing artist. Such a good artist. Such an amazing storyteller. I think that's really the thing. And that's what I like personally really want to get out of the pod is a lot of great takes on storytelling, you know, the really artistic part of being an artist, the part that reminds us the most of like why we're doing it. Like we all, you know, I mean, all of us technicians, you know, I think of myself a lot as a technician for the majority of my career. We remember at some point that we started painting because we had something we wanted to say, and inevitably you work and work and work and practice and practice and practice, and eventually you come back to that space where you say, all right, I have a story I want to tell. But you got to understand, storytelling is a skill too. You don't just show up back at that place and all of a sudden the stories tumble out of you like some kind of natural resource that you finally tapped. You have to work to tell stories. And so it's at this phase of my career where I'm looking so much at who I think are the great storytellers of our time, which is obviously, I think, film occupies a really big space in that field of storytelling. So those are the people that most interest me, that I most want to talk to, is kind of filmmakers, because I feel like they have insights about storytelling that fascinate me. Nick B says, nice, get out of the discipline. You all should find an analog photographer who uses painterly methods like silver, collodion photography, wet plate. I'm not sure what you're referring to here, Nick, but I do love the wet plate photography. I think it's fantastic. There's a place in New York called the Penumbra Foundation. It's run by Geoffrey Berliner, Jeffrey, who's a really, really cool artist and photographer. My wife and I did a workshop there when we lived in the city. And yeah, I just can't say enough good stuff about it. Like, it was such a cool experience. I only wish that I had like more time to like also be a photographer. But my life has taken me elsewhere. Let's see. What paper are Russian artists use at the Imperial Academy for drawing? This is a cool question. I asked my friend Ivan this question, and he just laughed and said like, oh yeah, no, I don't know. It's apparently like he uses some really cheap Russian paper. He said it's the same paper that they use to like print money on. So it's, I don't know, like this particular kind of, I assume like kind of parchment feel. Like if you think about what bills feel like, something like that is what the experience must be like. But I've never used it, so I can't say like what it actually is, but that's what he told me. All right, whoa, there's a lot of questions. A lot of questions. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through all of them. But because we're at the 2-hour mark, and I think my value study is more or less coming to a good place to call it finished. And I want to kind of review a little bit, right? So when we started this out, I said that all the values in the painting rely on all the other values, right? And that I didn't want to key the lightest light and the darkest dark immediately, because I wanted to fill up the canvas to get that context starting to work. So if you go back to the beginning of this video and you find this initial block in, it was a mid-tone about like this, that I left space to get to the lightest light from. And the same thing with all of this dark area through here. It was blocked in a pretty light mid-tone, really, and then painted down. The instructive part of this is, what you block in as in oil paint does not necessarily guarantee what you have to stay as, right? Like you can block in relatively light and eventually paint that into like a good, full, rich darkness. That's not a problem. That's the procedural part of like a la Prima painting, which is what this is, that I think is really, really great. Start in the middle, work your way out to those edges of the value scale. And then bear in mind the mistake, all right, You want to know this? Here's the secret. Here's the reveal at the end of the pod that everybody, or at the end of the pod, at the end of the live stream that everybody should understand. This is the secret at the end. Everybody does this wrong at the start. They will take a light area in a dark area and paint it too bright because they do not compare it to the lightest light. They only compare it locally. So if your painting is made out of a bunch of different local observations, it will guarantee that the whole thing doesn't hold together. So if you don't want to make that mistake, right? Key the darkest dark, key the lightest light after you block in the painting, and then paint everything else in relationship to those two reference points. But that's it. Guys, that's it. Actually, Nathan Elward has a comment I have to read. He says, Stephen, you suck. Watching your videos makes me want to draw this month or so and improving slowly. I think he says he has been doing it a bit this month and improving slowly, working on basic shapes and value, etc. Still can't draw a good circle or line. Nathan, I appreciate your effort, bud. And I appreciate everybody for your comments and hanging out with me and stuff. But I'm gonna go hang out with my wife and dog. But thank you everybody for being here. And this lesson will be up here, and I think eventually I'll probably make like a synopsis of it too, that I'll post here and on Patreon, so everybody can get this lesson, because I think it's really, really valuable. Just learning how to see values a little bit better. That's it. You want to learn stuff? Go to my Patreon. The link is in the description of this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.